A wealthy entrepreneur takes a keen interest in a young boy who he finds wandering near his company building. He offers to help him and his single mother until she uncovers subtle hints that something isn't right. What she discovers places her son at risk. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the bustling streets of New York City as Lisa Miller hurried through the crowds. Her mind raced with worries about the day ahead, juggling her two jobs and wondering how her son, Jimmy, was managing on his own. It wasn't easy being a single mother, but Lisa was determined to make a better life for them both. As she turned the corner onto a quieter street, her eyes caught sight of a familiar figure standing near the curb. It was Jimmy, his small frame hunched over a box of candy bars, trying to catch the attention of passers-by. Lisa's heart ached as she watched her son struggle to sell the sweets he had brought home from school. Despite his innocent smile, there was a weariness in his eyes that no child his age should have to bear. She was about to call out to him when a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The door opened and a tall, well-dressed man stepped out. He seemed out of place in this part of town, his presence commanding attention. The man's eyes scanned the street before settling on Jimmy, who had noticed him too. The man approached Jimmy with a kind smile. "Hello there," he said in a warm, friendly tone. "What are you selling?" Jimmy looked up, surprised by the man's interest. "Candy bars, sir. They're $1 each." The man nodded thoughtfully, then pulled out his wallet. "I'll take all of them," he said, handing Jimmy a crisp $20 bill. "I keep the change." Jimmy's eyes widened in disbelief. "Thank you, sir. Thank you so much." The man smiled and placed a hand on Jimmy's shoulder. "You're welcome, young man. You remind me of someone I knew a long time ago." He glanced up and noticed Lisa watching from a distance. "Is that your mother over there?" Jimmy nodded, his smile faltering slightly as he turned to see Lisa approaching. "Yes, that's my mom." The man waited as Lisa walked over, her heart pounding with a mix of curiosity and concern. She was taken aback by the stranger's kindness, but something about his demeanor put her on edge. "Good afternoon, Mom," the man said, extending his hand. "My name is Thomas Edwards. I couldn't help but notice your son here, and I wanted to offer a small gesture of support." Lisa shook his hand, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of the situation. "Thank you, Mr. Edwards. That was very generous of you." Thomas smiled warmly. "It's my pleasure. You know, I've been in a similar situation before, and I know how difficult it can be to get by. If you're open to it, I'd like to offer you both some help." Lisa hesitated, unsure of how to respond. This man seemed genuine, but she had learned long ago to be cautious of unexpected kindness. "Why don't we discuss it over a cup of coffee?" Thomas suggested, sensing her hesitation. "No strings attached, just a conversation." Lisa glanced at Jimmy, who was looking up at her with hopeful eyes. She sighed and nodded. "All right, Mr. Edwards, let's talk." The cafe was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the chilly autumn air outside. Lisa sat across from Thomas Edwards, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. Jimmy was beside her, happily munching on a cookie Thomas had bought for him. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his expression one of genuine concern. "I can see that you're doing your best, Lisa, but it's clear that you're facing some tough challenges. I was wondering if you might allow me to offer you a bit of assistance." Lisa's grip tightened on her cup. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Edwards, but I'm not sure I'm comfortable with accepting charity." Thomas smiled softly. "I understand, but this isn't charity. It's an opportunity. I'm in a position to help, and I'd like to do so because I believe in giving back. I'd like to offer you a job at my company, along with a place to stay for you and Jimmy. It's a fresh start, Lisa, one that could make a real difference." Lisa's mind was spinning. The offer sounded too good to be true, and yet there was something about Thomas that made her want to believe him. She looked at Jimmy, who was now fully engrossed in his cookie, oblivious to the weight of the conversation. "What kind of job are we talking about?" Lisa asked cautiously. It's an administrative position, well within your capabilities. It comes with a decent salary, health benefits, and housing in a safe neighborhood, Thomas explained. It's a stable environment for Jimmy too. He'll have access to better schools and opportunities. Lisa bit her lip, the temptation gnawing at her. A stable job, a safe place for Jimmy to grow up. It was everything she had been struggling to provide on her own. But the suddenness of the offer made her wary. Why would this man, a complete stranger, want to help them? Sensing her hesitation, Thomas leaned forward, his tone earnest. I know this seems sudden, Lisa, but I promise you, my intentions are genuine. I see a lot of potential in you, and I want to help you realize it. All I ask is that you think about it. Lisa nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She knew she couldn't make this choice lightly, but the allure of a better life for Jimmy was hard to ignore. All right, she said finally. I'll think about it. Thomas smiled, relief evident in his eyes. Take all the time you need, and if you decide to accept, the offer will still stand. As they left the cafe, Lisa's thoughts were a jumble of hope and doubt. She knew she had to be cautious, but the possibility of a better future was too enticing to dismiss outright. She just hoped she wasn't making a mistake. The following week passed in a blur of decisions and preparations. After much deliberation, Lisa decided to accept Thomas's offer. The promise of stability for Jimmy outweighed her lingering doubts. Thomas had arranged everything swiftly, too swiftly, perhaps, but Lisa was too overwhelmed by the prospect of a new start to question it. The day of the move arrived, with a mix of excitement and anxiety. Thomas had provided a moving service, and Lisa and Jimmy watched as their few belongings were carefully packed and transported to their new home. The apartment was in a quiet, upscale neighborhood, worlds away from the cramped, noisy environment they had grown accustomed to. As they entered the new apartment, Lisa felt a wave of relief wash over her. The place was spacious, clean, and tastefully furnished. It was more than she had ever hoped for. Jimmy ran from room to room, his eyes wide with amazement. "Mom, look at my room!" he called out, his voice echoing through the hall. Lisa followed him, smiling as she watched her son's excitement. The room was larger than their entire old apartment, with a bed big enough for two and a window that overlooked a small park. It was perfect. Thomas arrived later that afternoon to check on them. He moved through the apartment with a satisfied air, as if this were a project he had seen through to completion. "How are you settling in?" he asked, his tone warm and genuine. "It's wonderful, Mr. Edwards," Lisa replied, still in awe of their new surroundings. "I don't know how to thank you." "Please call me Thomas," he said with a smile. "And there's no need for thanks. I'm just glad to see you both happy." Jimmy bounded into the room, holding a new toy that had been left on his bed. "Thank you, Mr. Edwards. This place is amazing." Thomas chuckled and ruffled Jimmy's hair. "I'm glad you like it, Jimmy. You deserve a place where you can just be a kid." As the evening wore on, Thomas took his leave, but not before reminding Lisa that she could start her new job whenever she was ready. He left them with a warm smile and a gentle reminder to make themselves at home. After he was gone, Lisa sat on the couch, trying to process everything that had happened. It all felt like a dream, too good to be true. But as she looked around at the comfortable apartment and saw Jimmy playing happily, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things were finally going their way. But deep down, there was a small voice of caution, warning her that nothing in life came without a price. The first few weeks in their new home were blissful. Lisa settled into her job at Thomas's company, where she found the work manageable and the environment welcoming. Jimmy was adjusting well to his new school, and for the first time in years, Lisa felt a sense of security. However, as the days passed, Lisa began to notice small, unsettling details that chipped away at her newfound sense of peace. The first sign came when she discovered that some areas of their apartment were off-limits. Certain doors were always locked, and when she asked Thomas about them, he brushed off her concerns with a vague explanation about private storage. Then there were the staff members, too attentive, too present. Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching her, monitoring her every move. Whenever she mentioned it to Thomas, he would smile and assure her that the staff was simply there to ensure her comfort. But Lisa couldn't ignore the nagging suspicion that there was more to it. One evening, after putting Jimmy to bed, she decided to test her theory. She left her apartment and walked down the hallway, pretending to take a stroll. Sure enough, she noticed one of the staff members subtly following her at a distance. The next day, she brought it up with Thomas over lunch at his office. "Thomas, I've been noticing some strange things around the apartment. The locked doors, the staff always being around. It's starting to make me feel a bit uneasy." Thomas leaned back in his chair, his expression calm and reassuring. "Lisa, I understand your concerns, but I assure you, there's nothing to worry about. The locked rooms are just storage, and the staff is there to make sure you and Jimmy are comfortable and safe." He smiled, but there was a firmness in his tone that discouraged further questioning. Lisa nodded, not wanting to seem ungrateful, but the unease lingered. Meanwhile, Jimmy's bond with Thomas grew stronger. Thomas would visit often, bringing gifts and spending time with Jimmy, who was quickly becoming attached to him. This deepened Lisa's trust in Thomas, despite her growing concerns. As weeks turned into months, Lisa tried to push her worries aside, focusing on the positives. Jimmy was thriving, and for the first time in a long time, they were living comfortably. But the small voice in the back of her mind continued to whisper, reminding her that things might not be as perfect as they seemed. One evening, after a long day at work, Lisa decided to explore the apartment building a bit more. There were still parts of it she hadn't seen, and her curiosity had been gnawing at her for weeks. With Jimmy fast asleep, she grabbed a flashlight and quietly slipped out of their apartment, determined to find out what was behind those locked doors. As she moved down the dimly lit hallway, the sound of her footsteps echoed softly against the marble floor. She reached the end of the hall and stood in front of one of the locked doors that had piqued her interest. This particular door was slightly ajar, as if someone had forgotten to lock it properly. Heart-pounding, Lisa hesitated for a moment before gently pushing the door open. The hinges creaked as the door swung inward, revealing a room bathed in shadows. She stepped inside, her breath catching in her throat as her flashlight beam illuminated the space. The room was filled with photographs, carefully arranged on the walls and scattered across a large wooden desk. Lisa's eyes widened as she took in the images. They were all of a family, a man, a woman, and a young boy. But what made her blood run cold was how much the boy resembled Jimmy, and the woman in the photos looked disturbingly like herself. She moved closer, picking up one of the framed pictures. The family seemed happy, smiling brightly at the camera, but as she examined the photos more closely, Lisa noticed subtle details that sent a chill down her spine. The boy's smile didn't reach his eyes, and there was a tension in the woman's posture that suggested something was very wrong. Lisa's hands began to tremble as she set the picture down and scanned the rest of the room. There were other items too. Clothes, toys, and even some old faded school books. It was as if the room had been left untouched for years, a shrine to a family that had once lived there. A sinking feeling settled in Lisa's stomach. Who were these people? And why had Thomas kept this room locked away? Before she could dwell on it further, a voice from the doorway startled her. "What are you doing in here?" Lisa whirled around to see Thomas standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Her heart raced as she struggled to find her voice. I didn't mean to intrude." I was just curious. Thomas's eyes flicked to the photographs, then back to Lisa. For a moment, there was an intense silence between them, the air thick with unspoken tension. Finally, Thomas stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "These are memories," he said quietly, his voice carrying a hint of sadness. "This was my family, my wife and son. They're gone now." Lisa's breath caught in her throat. "I'm so sorry, Thomas. I didn't know." Thomas nodded, his expression softening. "It's all right. It was a long time ago. I don't talk about it much. I prefer to keep the past in the past." There was something in his tone that made Lisa uneasy, but she didn't push further. "I understand. I didn't mean to pry." Thomas gave her a small, strained smile. "It's okay, Lisa, but I'd appreciate it if you didn't come in here again. Some things are better left undisturbed." Lisa nodded, swallowing hard. "Of course." As she left the room, Thomas closed the door behind her, locking it with a soft click. Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that she had just uncovered something deeply unsettling, something that Thomas didn't want her to know. The days following her discovery were filled with a heavy sense of unease. Lisa couldn't stop thinking about the room and the photographs of the family that bore such an uncanny resemblance to her and Jimmy. It was as if the room was a ghostly reminder of something that should have remained hidden. Despite Thomas's assurances, Lisa couldn't ignore the growing doubts in her mind. The kind, generous man who had offered her a fresh start now seemed to harbor secrets that were far more sinister than she had ever imagined. But the safety and comfort that Thomas provided made it difficult for Lisa to make any rash decisions. She knew she had to tread carefully, but every fiber of her being screamed that something wasn't right. One evening, as she prepared dinner, Jimmy came into the kitchen with a smile on his face, holding a new toy that Thomas had given him. "Look what Mr. Edwards got me, Mom. Isn't it cool?" Lisa forced a smile, trying to mask her unease. "It's great, sweetheart. Why don't you go play with it in your room?" Jimmy nodded happily and ran off, leaving Lisa alone with her thoughts. She stared at the boiling pot on the stove, her mind racing. She knew she had to make a decision, whether to stay in this seemingly perfect situation that was beginning to feel more like a trap, or to take Jimmy and leave, despite the risks. That night, after Jimmy was asleep, Lisa sat in the living room, replaying everything that had happened since they moved in. The way Thomas had seamlessly integrated himself into their lives, the locked rooms, the photographs, the overly attentive staff. It all added up to something that Lisa couldn't ignore any longer. She knew she had to talk to Thomas, but the thought of confronting him filled her with dread. What if he reacted badly? What if he refused to let them leave? The thought of being trapped in this gilded cage was terrifying, but the thought of staying without addressing her concerns was even worse. The next morning, she resolved to talk to Thomas. She would be diplomatic, careful not to accuse him of anything outright, but she needed answers. She needed to know what kind of man he really was. That evening, as they sat down for dinner at Thomas's home, Lisa's heart pounded in her chest. Thomas was his usual charming self, chatting with Jimmy and asking about his day at school. But Lisa could barely focus on the conversation, her mind consumed with the decision she had made. Finally, after dessert had been served and Jimmy had run off to play, Lisa cleared her throat, gathering her courage. "Thomas, there's something I've been meaning to talk to you about." Thomas looked up, his expression calm and attentive. "Of course, Lisa. What's on your mind?" Lisa hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I've noticed a few things that have made me a little uneasy. I appreciate everything you've done for us, but I just want to make sure I understand everything that's going on here." Thomas set down his fork, his gaze steady. "What exactly are you referring to?" Lisa swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the moment. "The locked rooms, the photographs. I just want to make sure there aren't any surprises." For a brief moment, Something flickered in Thomas's eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. He smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Lisa, I understand your concerns, but I assure you, everything I've done is for your benefit and Jimmy's. There's nothing to worry about." Lisa nodded slowly, but the unease in her stomach didn't dissipate. As they finished dinner, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking a dangerous line, one that could lead to unforeseen consequences. Later that night, as Lisa prepared for bed, she found a note slipped under her door. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The words scrawled in an unfamiliar handwriting, "Get out while you still can." The ominous note burned in Lisa's mind as she sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the scrawled words. "Get out while you still can." The message was clear, but the sender was a mystery. Who had left it, and why? Lisa's initial shock quickly gave way to a rising tide of fear. She knew she couldn't ignore this warning, but the question was, what should she do? Should she pack up and leave immediately, or try to gather more information? Leaving so suddenly would raise Thomas's suspicions, but staying felt like playing with fire. Her mind raced with scenarios, each one more terrifying than the last. She thought of Jimmy, fast asleep in the next room, blissfully unaware of the danger that might be closing in on them. The thought of him being at risk made her decision clear. She needed to act, and she needed to act fast. The next morning, Lisa tried to carry on as usual, but her nerves were frayed. Every glance from the staff felt like a threat. Every sound made her jump. She went through the motions of her day, her mind spinning with possibilities. Jimmy, on the other hand, was completely at ease, enjoying the comfort and security of their new life. His happiness only added to Lisa's torment. She didn't want to tear him away from the life he was thriving in, but she knew she couldn't ignore the danger that lurked beneath the surface. As she watched Jimmy play with his new toys, her heart ached with the realization that she might have to uproot him yet again. But she also knew that his safety was more important than anything else. She would do whatever it took to protect him, even if it meant leaving everything behind. The thought of leaving without a plan terrified her, but staying put wasn't an option anymore. Lisa decided to reach out to someone who might be able to help, someone who knew Thomas better than anyone else. She needed to talk to Sarah Edwards, Thomas's estranged sister. Perhaps Sarah could shed some light on what was really going on. Lisa knew she had to be discreet. She couldn't risk Thomas finding out about her plans. She decided to send a message to Sarah, carefully worded and vague enough to avoid raising any alarms if intercepted. She used a public computer at a nearby library, ensuring that her actions couldn't be traced back to her. As she typed out the message, her hands trembled slightly. "Sarah, I need to talk to you about something important. It's about Thomas. Can we meet in person? Please let me know when and where. It's urgent." She sent the message and left the library, her heart pounding in her chest. Now, all she could do was wait and hope that Sarah would respond, and that she wouldn't be too late. Back at the apartment, Lisa tried to maintain a facade of normalcy, but the tension gnawed at her. Every time Thomas called or visited, she had to force herself to act naturally, smiling and nodding while her mind screamed with anxiety. Days passed, and just as Lisa was starting to lose hope, she received a reply from Sarah. The message was brief but to the point. "I'll meet you tomorrow at 3 p.m. at the cafe on 7th Avenue. Be careful." Relief washed over Lisa, but it was tempered with a renewed sense of urgency. Tomorrow could be her last chance to uncover the truth and find a way out. She just had to hold on a little longer and pray that she could outmaneuver Thomas before it was too late. The following day, Lisa left the apartment under the pretense of running errands, but her heart was pounding with anticipation. She knew this meeting with Sarah could be a turning point, a chance to understand what she was truly up against. Every step she took felt heavy with the weight of what was at stake. As she approached the cafe on 7th Avenue, Lisa glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see one of Thomas's staff following her. But the street was crowded, and if anyone was watching her, they were doing a good job of blending in. She quickened her pace, eager to reach the safety of the cafe. When she arrived, Sarah was already seated at a corner table, her posture tense as she sipped from a cup of coffee. Lisa hesitated for a moment before making her way over, trying to keep her expression neutral. "Sarah," Lisa asked softly as she reached the table. Sarah looked up, her eyes filled with a mix of concern and wariness. "Lisa, please sit down." Lisa took a seat, her mind racing as she tried to find the right words. "Thank you for meeting with me. I didn't know who else to turn to." Sarah nodded, her gaze flicking around the cafe as if she, too, was worried about being watched. "I had a feeling something was wrong when I got your message. What's going on?" Taking a deep breath, Lisa recounted everything: Thomas's unexpected generosity, the luxurious apartment, the locked rooms, the surveillance, and finally, the warning note. As she spoke, Sarah's expression grew increasingly troubled. When Lisa finished, Sarah leaned back in her chair, her face pale. "I knew Thomas was controlling, but this is beyond what I imagined." Lisa swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" Sarah hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Thomas has always been intense. He's used to getting what he wants, and he's very good at manipulating people to get it. But I never thought he would go this far. Those locked rooms, the way he's watching you, it sounds like he's trying to recreate something." "Recreate what?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling. Sarah glanced around again, lowering her voice. "A long time ago, Thomas had a family, a wife and son. They had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. I never knew the full story, but Thomas was devastated. He's been different ever since, obsessive, controlling. I think he's trying to recreate the family he lost, and it sounds like he's chosen you and Jimmy to fill that role." Lisa felt the blood drain from her face. "What happened to them, the wife and son?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I've always suspected that Thomas was involved in their disappearance. He was never charged, but there were rumors, whispers, that he might have had something to do with it. But there was never any proof." A cold dread settled over Lisa as she realized the full extent of the danger she and Jimmy were in. "Sarah, I have to get us out of there. But I don't know how. He's watching us so closely." Sarah nodded, her expression grim. "We need to be smart about this. If you try to leave without a plan, he'll catch on, and things could get even worse. We need to gather more information, find out exactly what we're dealing with, and then we can figure out a way to get you and Jimmy out safely." Lisa's mind raced as she tried to process everything. The stakes had just risen dramatically, and the danger was more real than ever. But with Sarah's help, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to escape Thomas's grasp. "All right," Lisa agreed, her voice firm. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect Jimmy. Let's figure out a plan." Sarah nodded, her determination matching Lisa's. "We'll get through this, Lisa. We just need to stay one step ahead of him." As they left the cafe, Lisa's heart pounded with a mix of fear and resolve. The road ahead was fraught with danger, but she knew she couldn't back down now. For Jimmy's sake, she had to stay strong and find a way out of the nightmare that had become their lives. The tension in Lisa's life only increased after her meeting with Sarah. She knew she had to remain calm and collected, but the pressure was immense. Every interaction with Thomas felt like walking on a tightrope, with one wrong step potentially leading to disaster. Yet, she knew that she couldn't afford to be passive. She had to take action, and soon. Lisa waited for the perfect moment to start investigating further. She knew that getting caught snooping around could be disastrous, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the answers she needed were hidden somewhere within Thomas's domain. One evening, after a long day at work, Thomas mentioned that he would be out for a few hours on business. This was the opportunity Lisa had been waiting for. As soon as he left, she tucked Jimmy into bed and quietly slipped out of the apartment, determined to explore the areas of the building that had previously been off-limits. Her first stop was the room she had discovered earlier, the one filled with photographs of the family that eerily resembled her and Jimmy. This time, Lisa was prepared. She brought a small camera with her, intending to document everything she found. She carefully pushed open the door, the familiar creak of the hinges sending a shiver down her spine. The room was just as she remembered, filled with relics of a past that was both haunting and mysterious. Lisa's eyes were immediately drawn to the photographs on the wall, and she quickly snapped pictures of each one, her hands trembling slightly as she did so. As she moved through the room, something caught her eye, a small locked drawer in the desk that she hadn't noticed before. Her heart raced as she tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Frustrated but determined, she searched the room for something that could help her pry it open. Finally, she found a letter opener and used it to carefully jimmy the lock. The drawer slid open with a soft click, revealing a stack of old, yellowed papers. Lisa's breath caught in her throat as she carefully lifted them out, her eyes scanning the contents. The papers were legal documents, birth certificates, marriage licenses, and even old medical records. But what startled Lisa the most was the name on these documents. They belonged to Thomas Edwards, but they also mentioned names she had never heard before, names that didn't match the ones in the photographs. She quickly photographed the documents, her mind racing as she tried to piece together what she was seeing. Could these be the identities of his previous family members, or perhaps aliases that Thomas had used in the past? The implications were chilling. Lisa knew she didn't have much time. She quickly returned the documents to the drawer, closed it, and carefully restored everything to its original place. Just as she finished, she heard the distant sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway. Panic surged through her as she realized that Thomas might be back earlier than expected. Without wasting another second, Lisa slipped out of the room and hurried back to her apartment, her heart pounding in her chest. She barely had time to compose herself before the front door opened and Thomas walked in, his expression unreadable. "Everything all right, Lisa?" Thomas asked, his voice calm but with an undercurrent of suspicion. Lisa forced a smile, her pulse racing. "Yes, just finishing up some work. How was your meeting?" Thomas studied her for a moment before answering. "Productive. I'm glad to hear you're keeping busy." They exchanged a few more pleasantries before Thomas retired to his office, leaving Lisa to grapple with the fear that she had narrowly avoided disaster. But despite the close call, she felt a renewed sense of determination. She was getting closer to the truth, and she wouldn't stop until she uncovered everything. The tension between Lisa and Thomas became almost palpable in the days that followed. Though he remained outwardly calm and kind, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that Thomas was growing more suspicious of her. His eyes seemed to linger on her a little too long, and his questions about her day felt more probing than before. Lisa knew she had to be careful. The last thing she wanted was to tip Thomas off to her investigations before she had a solid plan in place. She continued to play the role of the grateful beneficiary, all the while strategizing her next move. One evening, as Lisa was preparing dinner, she received a message on her phone. It was from Sarah, asking if they could meet again to discuss what she had found. Lisa agreed and suggested they meet the next day at a different cafe, hoping to keep their movements unpredictable. The next morning, Lisa left the apartment as planned, careful to act as though it were just another ordinary day. She headed to the cafe, constantly checking her surroundings to ensure she wasn't being followed. When she arrived, she spotted Sarah sitting at a table near the back, looking as tense as ever. As soon as Lisa sat down, Sarah leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "What did you find?" Lisa pulled out her phone and showed Sarah the photos she had taken of the documents. "I found these in a locked drawer in that room. I'm not sure what they mean, but I think they're connected to Thomas's past." Sarah's eyes widened as she scrolled through the images. "These names, I don't recognize them, but if they're connected to Thomas, it could mean he's been using different identities or has had other families we don't know about." Lisa nodded, her anxiety mounting. "I'm scared, Sarah. I think we're in more danger than we realized. We need to get out, but I don't know how to do it without him noticing." Before Sarah could respond, Lisa's phone buzzed with a new message. She glanced at it, and her heart nearly stopped when she saw it was from Thomas. "Lisa, where are you? I thought you were at home." Panic gripped Lisa as she realized her mistake. Thomas knew she wasn't where she said she'd be. She quickly texted back, trying to sound casual. "I'm just out running errands. I'll be back soon." Sarah noticed the shift in Lisa's demeanor and frowned. "What's wrong?" "Thomas knows I'm not home," Lisa whispered, her voice shaking. "I think he's onto us." Sarah's expression hardened. "We need to leave now. If he suspects anything, he might be watching this place." Lisa's mind raced as she grabbed her things. The last thing she needed was for Thomas to catch her meeting with Sarah. Together, they hurried out of the cafe and down the street, trying to blend in with the crowd. As they walked, Sarah spoke in a low, urgent tone. "We have to be more careful. If Thomas is getting suspicious, he might tighten his control. We need to find a way to leave without him noticing, but it's going to be risky." Lisa nodded, fear and determination battling for control within her. "We'll figure it out. We have to." When Lisa finally returned to the apartment, Thomas was waiting for her in the living room, his expression unreadable. "I was worried when you didn't answer your phone right away," he said, his tone calm but with an edge that made Lisa's skin crawl. "I'm sorry," Lisa replied, forcing a smile. "I was just in a rush and didn't hear it. Is everything all right?" Thomas studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Yes, everything's fine. I'm just glad you're back." But as Lisa went about her evening, she couldn't shake the feeling that Thomas's eyes were on her, every move, watching, waiting for her to make a mistake. The atmosphere in the apartment had grown increasingly tense, like a wire stretched to its breaking point. Lisa could feel the change in Thomas's demeanor, though he tried to maintain his usual calm and charming facade. There was an undercurrent of suspicion in his interactions with her, a subtle shift in the way he looked at her that made her skin prickle with unease. Lisa did her best to act normal, but her mind was constantly racing, trying to anticipate Thomas's next move. She knew that she had to be more cautious than ever, especially now that she suspected he was aware of her meeting with Sarah. The realization that she might have been followed or monitored left her feeling vulnerable and exposed. That evening, Thomas invited Lisa and Jimmy to join him for dinner at his home. It was a simple enough request, but the way he phrased it left Lisa with the distinct impression that it wasn't optional. She couldn't refuse without raising even more suspicion, so she agreed, her heart heavy with dread. As they arrived at Thomas's home, Lisa was struck by how different it felt. The warmth and comfort she had once associated with the place were gone, replaced by a cold, sterile atmosphere that made her shiver. Thomas greeted them at the door with his usual smile, but there was something off about it, something that made Lisa's stomach churn. The dinner started out normally enough. They sat at the large dining table, with Thomas engaging Jimmy in conversation about school and his hobbies. Lisa watched them closely, her nerves frayed as she tried to keep up appearances, but all the while she was waiting for the other shoe to drop, for Thomas to reveal his true intentions. It didn't take long. Halfway through the meal, Thomas set down his fork and leaned back in his chair, his gaze shifting from Jimmy to Lisa. "You've been rather busy lately, haven't you, Lisa?" he remarked, his tone casual but laced with something more sinister. Lisa's pulse quickened, but she forced a calm smile. "Just the usual errands. Nothing out of the ordinary." Thomas nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I see, but I couldn't help but notice that you've been meeting with some interesting people, like my sister, for instance." Lisa's blood ran cold. There it was, the confrontation she had been dreading. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Her mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation that wouldn't incriminate her, but she knew it was too late. Thomas's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You didn't think I'd find out, did you? I have to say, I'm disappointed, Lisa. After everything I've done for you and Jimmy, I thought we had built a certain level of trust." Jimmy looked up from his plate, sensing the tension in the room. "Mom? What's going on?" Lisa swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's nothing, Jimmy, just a misunderstanding." Thomas chuckled softly, but there was no humor in it. "Is that what you think this is? A misunderstanding? I don't think you fully grasp the situation, Lisa. You've been prying into things that don't concern you, and that's something I can't overlook." Lisa felt a surge of panic, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Thomas, I didn't mean to cause any trouble. I was just curious." "Curiosity can be dangerous," Thomas replied, his tone darkening, "especially when it leads you to places you shouldn't go. But don't worry, Lisa. I'm willing to forgive this little indiscretion. On one condition." Lisa's heart pounded in her chest. "And what's that?" Thomas leaned forward, his eyes cold and unyielding. "That you stop this nonsense immediately. No more meetings with Sarah. No more snooping around. You stay here where I can keep an eye on you, and we'll pretend none of this ever happened. But if you step out of line again, there will be consequences." Lisa nodded slowly, her mind reeling. She had no choice but to agree, but she knew that she couldn't trust Thomas. The trap had been set, and she was caught in it, with no clear way out. The days following the dinner were a blur of anxiety and fear. Lisa had agreed to Thomas's terms, but the weight of his threat hung over her like a dark cloud. She knew she was being watched even more closely now, every move scrutinized for any sign of disobedience. The walls of the gilded cage she had found herself in seemed to be closing in, suffocating her. Thomas's demeanor remained outwardly calm, but there was an unmistakable change in his behavior. He was always nearby, always watching, his presence a constant reminder of the control he now wielded over her life. The trust that had once existed between them, however superficial, was shattered, replaced by a cold, calculating vigilance that left Lisa on edge. Jimmy, blissfully unaware of the tension between the adults, continued to enjoy the life that Thomas had provided. He played with his toys, went to school, and spent time with Thomas as if nothing had changed. But Lisa knew that she couldn't let her guard down, not even for a moment. One wrong step could spell disaster for both of them. The surveillance became more overt. The staff members who had once been subtle in their attentiveness were now openly monitoring Lisa's actions. Every time she left the apartment, she felt eyes on her, watching, waiting for her to make a mistake. The sense of paranoia was overwhelming, but Lisa knew she had to keep up the charade, at least until she could find a way out. She spent her days going through the motions, trying to maintain a facade of normalcy, while her mind raced with plans and strategies. But each potential escape route seemed more impossible than the last. Thomas had anticipated everything, leaving her with no clear options. The thought of running away with Jimmy crossed her mind more than once, but the risks were too great. If Thomas caught them, the consequences would be dire. One evening, as Lisa was preparing dinner, she found herself staring out the window, lost in thought. The city lights twinkled in the distance, a stark contrast to the darkness that had settled over her life. She knew she couldn't stay in this situation forever, but the thought of confronting Thomas again filled her with dread. As she set the table, a sudden knock on the door startled her. Her heart leaped into her throat as she wondered who it could be. Thomas never knocked. He had keys to the apartment and usually let himself in. She hesitated for a moment before opening the door. To her surprise, it was one of the staff members, a young woman who had always been particularly attentive. The woman's expression was neutral, but there was something in her eyes that made Lisa uneasy. "Good evening, Miss Miller," the woman said politely. "Mr. Edwards has requested your presence in his office." Lisa's stomach churned with anxiety, but she forced a smile. "Of course, I'll be right there." The woman nodded and left, leaving Lisa alone with her thoughts. She knew this couldn't be good. Thomas rarely summoned her to his office unless it was something important, and given the current situation, that could only mean trouble. As she made her way to Thomas's office, Lisa tried to calm her nerves. She had to be careful, had to keep her wits about her. Whatever Thomas had planned, she needed to be ready for it. When she arrived, Thomas was sitting behind his desk, his expression unreadable. He gestured for Lisa to sit down, and she did so, her heart pounding in her chest. "Lisa," Thomas began, his voice calm but firm, "I've been thinking about our situation, and I believe it's time for some changes." Lisa's pulse quickened. "What kind of changes?" Thomas leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "You're going to be spending more time here, under my supervision. I'll be taking a more active role in Jimmy's upbringing as well. It's for the best, given everything that's happened. We need to ensure that things stay under control." Lisa swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady. "And what if I don't agree?" Thomas's smile was cold, devoid of any warmth. "Then, Lisa, I'm afraid you won't have much of a choice." The cage had closed, and Lisa knew she was trapped. But as she stared into Thomas's eyes, she also knew that she couldn't give up. There had to be a way out. She just had to find it before it was too late. Lisa returned to her apartment, her mind swirling with fear and frustration. Thomas's words echoed in her ears, reminding her that she was now more trapped than ever. The once generous benefactor had revealed his true nature, and Lisa knew she was running out of time. She had to find a way to protect Jimmy and escape from Thomas's ever-tightening grip. That night, after putting Jimmy to bed, Lisa sat alone in the living room, contemplating her next move. She knew that if she stayed, Thomas would eventually take full control over their lives, but leaving was nearly impossible, with the constant surveillance and the ever-watchful eyes of Thomas's staff. The stakes were higher than ever, and Lisa needed to think of something fast. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, and she glanced at it, expecting another message from Thomas or one of his employees. Instead, she was surprised to see a message from Sarah. "We need to meet. I've found something that might help us." Lisa's heart skipped a beat. Sarah had been her only ally in this nightmare, and the thought that she might have found a way out filled Lisa with a glimmer of hope. She quickly replied, agreeing to meet Sarah the next day. The following morning, Lisa made sure to keep up appearances. She prepared breakfast for Jimmy, saw him off to school, and made her way to the office as usual. But her mind was elsewhere, focused entirely on the upcoming meeting with Sarah. When she arrived at the cafe where they had agreed to meet, Sarah was already there, seated at a table near the back. Lisa joined her, and the two exchanged a brief, tense greeting. "What did you find?" Lisa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah leaned in, her expression serious. I've been digging into Thomas's past, trying to find something we can use against him. I finally found a lead. There's a former employee of his, a woman named Margaret, who might have some information. She worked for Thomas years ago, around the time his first family disappeared. She left under mysterious circumstances, but I managed to track her down. Lisa's pulse quickened. Do you think she knows what happened? It's possible, Sarah replied. If we can get her to talk, she might have the evidence we need to expose Thomas and get you and Jimmy out of there safely. But we have to be careful. Thomas is already suspicious, and if he finds out what we're doing... Lisa nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. Where is she? Can we meet her? I've arranged a meeting for tomorrow, Sarah said, but we need to be discreet. We'll have to make sure Thomas doesn't find out. Lisa agreed, her resolve hardening. This was their last hope, and she couldn't afford to let it slip through her fingers. The next day would be crucial. Either they would find the information they needed to escape, or they would be trapped forever under Thomas's control. As Lisa left the cafe, she couldn't help but feel a mixture of fear and determination. The road ahead was fraught with danger, but she knew she had to see this through. For Jimmy's sake, she would do whatever it took to free them from Thomas's grasp, no matter the cost. The next morning, Lisa woke up with a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. Today was the day. She had to meet with Margaret, the former employee who might hold the key to their freedom. But with Thomas's watchful eyes always on her, pulling this off would be the most dangerous task yet. She went through her morning routine with Jimmy, trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy. She smiled as she packed his lunch, chatted with him about his school day, and kissed him goodbye as he left for school. But beneath the surface, her mind was racing, planning every step of what she had to do next. Lisa knew that she couldn't let Thomas know where she was going. She had to make her departure seem completely ordinary, just another day of errands and work. She left the apartment, her heart pounding in her chest, knowing that she had to keep her movements as unremarkable as possible. After arriving at work, Lisa made sure to be seen by a few co-workers, establishing her presence. Then, when she was sure no one was watching too closely, she quietly slipped out of the office, heading toward the meeting place Sarah had arranged. It was a small, out-of-the-way park, where they hoped they could speak with Margaret without drawing attention. When Lisa arrived, she spotted Sarah standing near a bench, looking around nervously. Beside her was a woman in her late 40s, with tired eyes and an air of nervousness. This had to be Margaret. Lisa approached them, trying to mask her own anxiety. "Margaret?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with urgency. Margaret nodded, glancing around as if expecting someone to be watching. "You're the one Sarah told me about." "Yes," Lisa replied. "Please, we need your help. Thomas, he's not who he appears to be. We need to know what you know." Margaret sighed, her expression conflicted. "I left Thomas's employ years ago, but what I saw back then, it still haunts me. His first family, there were always rumors, things that didn't add up. I kept my head down and did my job, but when they disappeared, I knew something was wrong. The police were involved, but Thomas covered everything up. I don't have any hard evidence, but I know he was involved in their disappearance." Lisa felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. "Do you have anything that could help us? Anything that could expose him?" Margaret hesitated, then nodded. "There were some documents, things I kept hidden after I left. They're not conclusive, but they might be enough to start an investigation to get the authorities involved." "Where are they?" Sarah asked, her voice low and urgent. "They're in a storage unit," Margaret replied. "I can get them to you, but it'll take some time. And you need to be careful. Thomas has eyes everywhere. If he even suspects that you're trying to get out, he'll stop at nothing to keep you in line." Lisa's mind raced. Time was running out, and they needed those documents. But the thought of waiting, of biding her time while knowing how close she was to the truth, was unbearable. "We'll be careful," Lisa said, her voice firm. "But please, get those documents as soon as you can. This is our only chance." Margaret nodded, her expression grave. "I'll get them. Just stay safe." As Lisa and Sarah left the park, Lisa felt a renewed sense of urgency. They were so close to finding the evidence they needed, but the danger was greater than ever. The window of opportunity was closing, and she knew they had to act quickly if they were going to escape Thomas's clutches once and for all. But as they walked away, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and she glanced over her shoulder, scanning the crowd for any sign of Thomas's men. Seeing nothing, she tried to calm herself, but the fear lingered. They had to be careful. One wrong move, and everything could come crashing down. As the days passed, Lisa found it increasingly difficult to keep up the facade of normalcy. Every moment felt like a test of her resolve, as if the walls were closing in on her. Thomas's presence was more oppressive than ever. He seemed to be everywhere, watching, waiting for any sign of betrayal. Margaret had promised to retrieve the documents that could help expose Thomas, but the wait was excruciating. Every time Lisa received a call or text, her heart would leap into her throat, hoping it was Margaret with news, but each time it was a false alarm. The tension was wearing on her, fraying her nerves to the breaking point. One evening, after putting Jimmy to bed, Lisa sat alone in the living room, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. The apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. She was trapped, with no clear way out, and the fear of what Thomas might do if he discovered her plans was overwhelming. The sound of the front door opening snapped Lisa out of her thoughts. She tensed, her heart racing as Thomas stepped into the room. His expression was calm, but there was something in his eyes that made Lisa's blood run cold. "Good evening, Lisa," Thomas said, his voice smooth but with an edge that sent chills down her spine. "Thomas," Lisa replied, forcing a smile. "I didn't expect you to be back so soon." Thomas walked over to the couch and sat down beside her, his gaze never leaving her. "I've been thinking a lot lately, Lisa, about our arrangement, about how things have been going." Lisa's pulse quickened. She could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken threat in his words. "Is something wrong?" Thomas tilted his head slightly, studying her. "I don't know, Lisa. Is there? You've been different lately, distracted. I can't help but wonder if there's something you're not telling me." Lisa's mind raced as she tried to think of a way to deflect his suspicions. "I'm just tired, that's all. It's been a lot to adjust to, and I've been worried about Jimmy, about how he's handling everything." Thomas nodded slowly, but there was no warmth in his expression. "I see. But I can't help but feel like there's more to it than that. Like maybe you're keeping something from me." Lisa swallowed hard, her hands trembling slightly. She knew she was walking a dangerous line, and one wrong move could spell disaster. "Thomas, I'm not hiding anything. I'm just trying to do what's best for Jimmy." There was a long silence, and then Thomas leaned closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Lisa, I'm going to be very clear with you. If you're planning something, anything that could undermine what we've built here, you need to stop, right now. Because if you don't, the consequences will be severe." Lisa felt a surge of fear, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "I'm not planning anything, Thomas. I'm just trying to keep our lives together." Thomas stared at her for a long moment, his eyes cold and calculating. Then, without another word, he stood up and walked to the door. "Good night, Lisa. I hope you'll think carefully about what I've said." As the door closed behind him, Lisa let out a shaky breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never felt more trapped, more helpless. Thomas's threat was clear. He was watching her, and any slip-up could cost her everything. The darkest hour had come, Lisa knew she was running out of time, and the pressure to find a way out was more intense than ever. But with Thomas tightening his grip, the chances of escape were growing slimmer by the minute. The next morning, Lisa awoke with a sense of dread that weighed heavily on her chest. Thomas's veiled threats from the night before replayed in her mind, reminding her of just how precarious her situation had become. She knew she couldn't afford to wait any longer. Margaret's documents were their last hope, and Lisa was determined to get them, no matter the risk. She went through her morning routine with Jimmy, trying to mask the anxiety gnawing at her. When she dropped him off at school, she held him a little longer than usual, whispering a promise to keep him safe. Then, with a heavy heart, she headed to work, where she planned to slip away and meet Sarah and Margaret at the storage unit. Lisa arrived at work and tried to act as normal as possible, but the tension was palpable. She could feel the eyes of Thomas's staff on her, watching her every move. She couldn't let them see her slip away, so she waited for the perfect moment, keeping her anxiety at bay through sheer willpower. Finally, during a lull in the day, Lisa made her move. She quietly left the office, her heart racing as she made her way to the storage unit. She knew this was it, the final confrontation. Everything hinged on what she found there. When she arrived, Sarah and Margaret were already waiting, both looking just as anxious as Lisa felt. Margaret led them to the unit, her hands trembling slightly as she unlocked the door. Inside were stacks of boxes, filled with old documents, photographs, and other remnants of Thomas's past. Margaret quickly located the box she had mentioned, pulling it out and setting it on a small table. "This is everything I managed to keep from my time working for Thomas," she said, her voice low and urgent. "There are records here that might be enough to expose him, evidence of financial misconduct, correspondence that hints at his involvement in his family's disappearance. It's not conclusive, but it's a start." Lisa rifled through the documents, her hands shaking as she read through the damning evidence. It was all here, enough to at least spark an investigation, to draw the attention of the authorities. But as she scanned the papers, a sickening realization hit her. If Thomas knew she had these documents, he wouldn't stop at anything to silence her. The danger was greater than ever. "We need to get this to the police," Lisa said, her voice barely steady. "But we have to be careful. If Thomas finds out before we're ready—" Margaret nodded. "I understand. We'll need to move quickly before he realizes what we're doing." Just as they were about to leave, Lisa's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, her heart nearly stopping when she saw the name on the screen, Thomas. He was calling her. Panic surged through her as she considered whether to answer, but ignoring the call would only make him more suspicious. She took a deep breath and answered, trying to keep her voice calm. "Thomas?" "Lisa." Thomas's voice was smooth, but there was an edge to it that made her blood run cold. "I've been trying to reach you. Where are you?" Lisa's mind raced as she tried to think of a plausible excuse. "I'm just out running some errands. I'll be back soon." There was a brief pause on the other end, and Lisa's heart pounded in the silence. Then Thomas spoke again, his tone darker than before. "I think it's time you came home, Lisa, now." Lisa's stomach churned with fear. He knew. He had to know. She quickly ended the call, her hands shaking as she turned to Sarah and Margaret. "He knows. We have to move, now." They quickly gathered the documents, shoving them into a bag. There was no time to waste. They needed to get to the police before Thomas could stop them. But as they exited the storage unit, Lisa's worst fears were confirmed. One of Thomas's men was waiting for them, standing by a black car parked near the entrance. "Get in the car," the man ordered, his voice cold and authoritative. Lisa's mind raced as she realized they had no choice. They were caught, and the final showdown was about to begin. The tension in the car was suffocating as Lisa, Sarah, and Margaret were driven back to Thomas's home. The man driving kept a steely silence, his eyes fixed on the road, while Lisa's mind raced with fear and dread. She clutched the bag containing the documents tightly, knowing they were her only hope, but also fearing they might never see the light of day. When they arrived at Thomas's home, he was waiting for them in the grand foyer, his expression unreadable. The sight of him standing there, calm and composed, sent a chill down Lisa's spine. This was the man who had manipulated and controlled their lives, and now he had them right where he wanted. "Lisa," Thomas greeted her with a cold smile. "Sarah and Margaret. How unexpected." Lisa stepped forward, her voice trembling but determined. "Thomas, it's over. We have the evidence. We know what you've done." Thomas raised an eyebrow, his smile never wavering. "And what exactly do you think you know, Lisa? That I've been trying to help you, to give you and Jimmy a better life." "Don't play games with me," Lisa snapped, her fear giving way to anger. "We know about your first family, about how they disappeared, and we know about the crimes you've been hiding behind your charity. You won't get away with this." Thomas's smile faded, his eyes hardening as he took a step toward her. "You have no idea what you're talking about. You think you've uncovered some grand conspiracy, but all you have are suspicions and circumstantial evidence, nothing that can stand up in court." Lisa's heart pounded as she realized he might be right. The documents Margaret had provided were damning, but would they be enough to bring down a man as powerful as Thomas? She glanced at Sarah, who was standing beside her, pale but resolute. "You're wrong, Thomas," Sarah said, her voice steady. "The truth will come out. You can't keep controlling people's lives, not anymore." Thomas's gaze shifted to his sister, his expression darkening. "You've always been a disappointment, Sarah, always meddling, always trying to ruin what I've built. But I won't let you destroy this." He reached for the bag in Lisa's hands, but she pulled it back, clutching it tightly. "No, Thomas, this ends now." For a moment, the room was silent, the tension crackling in the air. Then, to everyone's surprise, Thomas's cold exterior cracked. He let out a bitter laugh, his eyes glinting with something between madness and despair. "You think you can just walk away?" he said, his voice rising. "After everything I've done for you, for Jimmy, I gave you everything, Lisa, everything, and this is how you repay me." Lisa took a step back, her heart racing. She had never seen Thomas like this, so unhinged, so desperate. "What you did wasn't help, Thomas. It was control. You tried to mold us into something we're not, and that's not love. It's manipulation." Thomas's face twisted with rage, and for a moment, Lisa feared he might lash out. But instead, he turned away, his shoulders slumping as if the fight had drained out of him. "You're right," he said quietly, his voice hollow. "I wanted to create something perfect, something that would make up for everything I lost. But it's all falling apart, isn't it?" Lisa watched him warily, unsure if this was another manipulation or the genuine breaking point of a man who had lost control. "It doesn't have to end like this, Thomas. You can still do the right thing." Thomas turned back to her, and for the first time, she saw something resembling regret in his eyes. "Maybe you're right, but it's too late for that now, isn't it?" Before Lisa could respond, the sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder as they approached the house. Margaret must have alerted the authorities before they were taken. Relief washed over Lisa as she realized that help was finally on the way. Thomas looked toward the door, his expression resigned. "I suppose this is where it ends," he said quietly. Lisa nodded, her grip on the bag loosening as the police arrived. "Yes, Thomas, it's over." The police burst through the door, their weapons drawn, and Thomas didn't resist as they moved to arrest him. He simply stood there, defeated, as they placed him in handcuffs and led him away. As Thomas was taken out of the house, Lisa felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The nightmare was finally over. She glanced at Sarah and Margaret, who both looked equally relieved. and together they walked outside, stepping into the light of a new beginning. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of events, but for Lisa, they felt like a slow return to normalcy. A normalcy she hadn't realized she'd lost until now. The media frenzy around Thomas's arrest was intense, but with Margaret's documents and Sarah's testimony, the authorities had enough to begin a full investigation. Thomas Edwards, the once revered philanthropist, was exposed as a manipulative criminal, and the public's shock was palpable. Lisa spent her days cooperating with the authorities, giving statements and providing any information that could help the case. It was exhausting, but each day brought her closer to the peace she so desperately needed. Throughout it all, she kept Jimmy shielded from the worst of it, ensuring that his life remained as stable as possible. One morning, after dropping Jimmy off at school, Lisa returned home and found Sarah waiting for her in the kitchen. The two women had grown closer through their ordeal, their shared experience forging a bond that Lisa hadn't expected. "How are you holding up?" Sarah asked, handing Lisa a cup of coffee. Lisa smiled, grateful for the small kindness. "Better. It still feels surreal, but I think we're going to be okay." Sarah nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about Thomas. I still can't believe how far he was willing to go to control people's lives." Lisa sighed, taking a sip of her coffee. "He was a deeply troubled man. I don't think he ever truly recovered from losing his first family, but that doesn't excuse what he did." "No, it doesn't," Sarah agreed. "But you did the right thing, Lisa. You stood up to him, and you protected Jimmy. That's what matters." Lisa looked out the window, the morning sunlight streaming through the glass. "I just want Jimmy to have a normal life. He deserves that." "And he will," Sarah said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "You both will." The weeks turned into months, and life gradually began to settle. With Thomas behind bars and the investigation ongoing, Lisa and Jimmy moved into a new apartment, far from the memories of the past. It wasn't as luxurious as the one Thomas had provided, but it was theirs, and that was enough. Lisa found a new job, one that allowed her to spend more time with Jimmy, and she focused on building a stable, loving home for them. She was determined to give Jimmy the childhood he deserved, free from fear and manipulation. One evening, as they sat down to dinner, Jimmy looked up at his mother, his eyes filled with curiosity. "Mom, are we safe now?" Lisa smiled, reaching across the table to take his hand. "Yes, sweetheart, we're safe, and we're going to be okay." Jimmy nodded, satisfied with her answer, and returned to his meal. Lisa watched him for a moment, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the simple moments of peace they could now enjoy. After dinner, Lisa tucked Jimmy into bed and kissed him goodnight. As she stood in the doorway, watching him drift off to sleep, she felt a profound sense of relief. The nightmare that had consumed their lives was finally over, and they could look forward to the future with hope. The next morning, Lisa met Sarah for coffee at a small cafe near their new apartment. They sat by the window, the sun shining brightly outside, a stark contrast to the darkness they had endured. "So, what's next for you?" Sarah asked, stirring her coffee. Lisa smiled, feeling lighter than she had in months. "I'm not sure yet, but for the first time in a long time, I'm excited to find out." Sarah raised her cup in a toast. "To new beginnings." Lisa clinked her cup against Sarah's, her smile widening. "To new beginnings." As they sipped their coffee, Lisa looked out at the bustling city streets, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. She had faced the darkness and come out stronger on the other side. Now, it was time to embrace the light. If you enjoyed, consider subscribing to our channel and supporting us through the thanks button.